Nyní zůstaneme trošku v těch financích a ponoříme se do světa nových trendů v oceňování. Náš další host strávil svou kariéru v oblasti komerčních nemovitostí po celé Evropě. Je známý nejen díky svým odborným znalostem, ale také díky tomu, že dokáže přinést jistou dávku nadhledu i do těžkých témat. Rozhovor s ním povede Kryštof Tichý. A protože tento rozhovor bude probíhat čistě v angličtině, dovolím si hosta přivítat také v tomto jazyce. Please join me in welcoming Andrew Peirson, Managing Director at IO Partners.
Okay, so good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. As Sharka said, our guest today is Andrew Peirson, Managing Director at IO Partners. Oh, okay, thank you. So Andrew spent his career within commercial real estate, and I can say that he's not only known for his expertise, but also for bringing a certain level of showmanship to what many might consider a dry subject. And before we dive in, I can also tell you that I started my career also in valuation company in Prague, a competitor of yours. So I was looking forward to this conversation. So I know that you worked on multiple European markets, and I would like to ask you, how do approaches differ in terms of transactions, competition, valuation practices, like between Central, Western, and Eastern Europe, if you can tell us?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Yeah, look, I think firstly from a valuation standpoint, and I'll compare kind of the UK where I'm from and what we would call Central and Eastern Europe, which is where I've spent most of my time. Valuation from that perspective is really different when you look at, certainly from Western Europe to more East. I started as a valuer in my career, and I wasn't particularly great at it. I moved in more into transactions, but when I was a valuer in the UK, one of the biggest differences was actually your contact was the bank, so you never got any pressure. So if we were valuing for a bank, whether it was for secured lending or mortgage purposes, we would never really meet the borrower. We would never meet the developer or the buyer of the real estate. We would only meet the bank. And so all the information would come from the bank. And so we were much more comfortable in terms of valuing at our opinion, because we weren't under pressure, which is often what you get. Czech is one of the better markets in this region, but kind of the further east you go, the more difficult it can be to value, because as you say, I spent most of my time on the European side, but it wasn't in Germany or France. I was in Czech, Bulgaria, Serbia, Romania, some of these markets. And I have to say that's where you'll see massive value fluctuation. And so what you tend to have in these markets, the instructions tend to come from the borrower, so they come from the investor, not from the bank. And you know, we'll talk a lot around things like AI and data and how things are changing, but at the end of the day, the pressure that you get put under sometimes as a valuer can be quite hard to deal with. Whereas, like I said, Germany, the UK, you don't really have that pressure. You don't really have this sometimes shouting, screaming by clients, pushing you to get to certain expectations. You don't get that in the West. In the East, that's much more common. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges as a valuer you find here, is that often you do get put under pressure. I say Czech is easier because we don't see much fluctuation in value. If anything, values only tend to either remain stable or go up. When you go east and you go to places like Romania or some of these markets, which are really volatile, that's when you see value fluctuation, and that's when you see a complete different landscape in terms of how you value. I think when it comes to transactions, actually it sounds strange, but when I was in the UK, I found deals were easier. I actually found that if you work in more Western markets, everybody has their kind of position. So you've got your real estate guy, you've got your accountant, tax guy, and you've got your lawyer. And so when you're doing a transaction, on the real estate side, you would kind of finish quite early. Once you'd agreed the main commercial principle of a deal, your work was done. Whereas when you come into Europe, actually you're expected to do everything. So all of a sudden instead of just being a real estate advisor, which in the UK was relatively quite easy to do, all of a sudden you come into Europe and I'm supposed to know everything about tax, about law. These are things that I was never educated in. And so that was the biggest difference I found coming into Europe, and certainly from client expectations too. People expect you to know everything. And I think if you go to, like I said, to Germany, France, the UK, as a real estate guy, there's a line where you can say, that's not my job, that's not my skill set, and I don't do that. Over here, you're expected to do everything. Okay. And that makes it very tough.
Okay, thank you. So maybe we should also have a closer look at this country. I think that all of us would be interested in how foreign investors perceive the Czech market.
I think that the general, I think if you look at this region, Czech is the jewel of the region at the moment. So, you know, certainly foreign investors, when they're coming in, whether they're coming from Western Europe, the US, or Asia, they don't like risk. And so Czech is probably the country, probably the only country at the moment in this region where they don't see risk. You know, there's not a big risk about vacancy. There's not, because it's very difficult to develop here. So, you know, if you buy an office building, for instance, in Prague, you know that your vacancy is going to remain quite high because it's so difficult to build another one. And so from a kind of supply-demand perspective, Czech's quite boring because you can really foresee what will happen because it's so difficult to build anything. Okay. Again, that's not the case when you go east, where permitting is a free-for-all sometimes, and you can build anything you want. And so I've seen investors in certain markets. A really famous one was in Bulgaria, which was an American fund, bought a shopping center, and within 3 years they had 3 competing shopping centers on the doorstep, which weren't planned when they bought that. You don't get that in Czech. I think the biggest, I would say the biggest reaction to investors when they look at Czech is that they're surprised how expensive it is. And I'm not talking about residential prices, which obviously everybody knows is incredibly high. I mean, an example, we were selling Myslbek, which is actually the building we're in the center of Prague recently. And we had 7 bids on that building. There was 5 Czech buyers and 2 foreigners, and the foreigners came 6th and 7th. And the Czechs were numbers 1 to 5. So I think foreign investors, when they're coming in, and if you look at where investors have historically come from in this region, it was mainly Germany. So, you know, in the kind of mid-2000s, the structure was, if you were a local developer, you would build an office building, 99% of the time you would sell it to a German investor. It was the same in Poland, it was the same in Hungary, Slovakia. It was the Germans, the Austrians, a bit of British-American, but it was mainly those 2 investors. If you're a German investor today and you're sitting in Hamburg or in Munich and you want to buy an office building in Prague, it's cheaper to buy an office building in Berlin. So this is the feedback that investors are getting now. We're trying to go around our network and speak to investors in different countries, but the reaction is always, it's cheaper for us to buy in our home market. And so those investors are not taking unnecessary risk by buying in Czech when they can buy in their home market for cheaper. So I think that's the feeling at the moment from the Czech perspective. And why I say Czech is the jewel is because it doesn't take much for foreign investors to all of a sudden be put off by a market. You look at this region at the moment, apologies if there's people from Slovakia here, but investors from outside aren't looking at Slovakia at the moment due to potential political risk. They're not looking at Hungary because there's a clear political risk. They're not looking at Serbia because there's a massive political risk. Romania, again, political risk at times. So it doesn't take much all of a sudden for someone to just turn off and think that market's not for me. At the moment, people don't have that feeling for Czech yet. Maybe that'll change soon, but it doesn't take much for foreign investors to change opinion. And keep in mind, if you're coming in from Western Europe or Asia or the US, buying in a market like the Czech Republic is still a little bit moving into the unknown and a little bit of a risk. You know, it's still perceived as kind of Central and Eastern Europe, not Western. And so it doesn't take much for them to kind of turn their back on it. And at the moment, they're not doing it for Czech yet. But I think for the rest of the region, I think foreign investors have largely pulled away.
Okay. So would you recommend people investments in Czech real estate at the moment?
If I was a Czech investor, yeah. I mean, look at the market at the moment. I mean, who'd have thought 10 years ago that palladium in the center of Prague would be sold to Czechs? Like, that was unheard of, that a Czech group could put together 700 million euros plus of debt and equity and buy a massive shopping center in the center of Prague. I would never have thought that would be possible. But again, if you look at the people trying to buy palladium, it was mainly Czechs. There was a couple of foreigners coming in, but they weren't at pricing. So, look, if I was advising a German investor today where to invest, I'd probably say Germany. Would I say to invest in Prague? Probably not, because the pricing is so high for them. But the one difference you've got in Czech is there's a huge amount of Czech local money, and it's really specific to Czech. You know, I'm sure the previous speaker from the bank will be much better for answering this question, but I think it's a mentality thing. Like, I know so many people that invest in Czech real estate funds in Czech. I don't know anybody in the UK or the US or anywhere else that invests in real estate funds. And I know that here you kind of have the REIT laws and there's a way of doing it. In Poland, they don't have the legislation yet to do that, but there's a massive amount of people that just put their money into real estate funds here. You know, they'll look at the economy magazines and the newspapers, and they'll look at the returns that these guys are giving, and they'll just put their money into it. And it doesn't matter if it's 10 euros as a retail fund or it's one of these kind of qualified investors where you've got to be 100,000. People are putting the money into them. And when I was talking about something like palladium, you know, the buyer of palladium, they're bringing in 30, 40 million euros a month in terms of local investment money. It's a massive pot of cash that then they need to go and spend. And so what that does is, because the Czech mentality is invest in funds, actually, instead of keeping the money in the bank, they want to see returns on that. It's giving this huge amount of pot of money for Czech investors to go out and buy. And so, you know, the biggest investors in Poland at the moment are Czechs. The biggest investors in Czech is Czechs. You know, you go down to Croatia, biggest investors out at the moment are Czechs. So what we have in the region at the moment is, whenever we're selling a building in any market, the first thing that everybody does is call us up asking for contacts of the Czech funds, because they're the new Germans. And that, therefore, to answer the first question, would I tell foreign investors to buy in Czech at the moment? No, because it's too expensive for them. But for Czechs, it makes a lot of sense. There's no country risk, there's no currency risk. They know what they're buying, they understand the markets better. And so there's two answers to that, I think. For foreign investors, clearly it's an attractive market, but they'll get better returns in Western Europe, places like Italy, Spain, the UK, Germany, clearly, than you would in Czech at the moment.
Okay, thank you for the advice. And maybe what about banks versus the clients? Because we know that the valuations often serve banking purposes, but the clients might have a different perspective. So how do you balance these two worlds? And who usually wins in this fight?
The bank. I'm not sure I quite understand the question. So you're asking kind of the balance between expectations?
The expectations in terms of valuation from the perspective of bank, and on the other side, the client. Yeah,
well, look, I mean, there's valuations for different purposes, whether you're looking for bank valuations or you're looking for fund valuations, which is more what we would do. Look, I think there's different pressures, isn't there, from different sides. I think the banks want to see sensible valuations, you know, and I think you can see that sensible valuations in Czech. Look, I think one of the big challenges in the market like Czech, which is quite a small market, but it's heavily oversubscribed by the service industry, by advisors, is, like it or not, there's always a way of shopping around to try and get a higher value. And I think that's one of the worst things we see in this market, that there will be some smaller groups that will work around and be quite inventive of trying to get to a higher value. That obviously is what the borrower wants to see. They want to see their value going up. They want to make sure that they're meeting the kind of the banking requirements in terms of the loan agreements. But the bank want to see consistency and they want to see a solid performance of an asset. They don't want to see values going up 10, 15% in a quarter because it keeps the borrower happy. So it's a real balance, but at the end of the day, the bank calls the shots. And so I think certainly what we need to do is keep our eye on the fact that the banks are the most important people at the moment because they're the ones supplying the debt. And regardless of all of this equity coming in, obviously you'll be doing your lectures here, but there's still debt required in order to do these deals, and so the banks still kind of call the shots. But again, with the banks, there's a huge amount of banks here that are willing to finance, and so I think for borrowers, there's an awful lot of shopping around to do as well. It's not kind of 2 or 3 banks. You know, you've got a pick of 8, 10 banks that can finance.
Okay, I see. And I also see that our time is running very quickly. So maybe let's do a little time travel. If we are sitting here in 2030, for example, what would we be talking about here? What are the main challenges that lie ahead in terms of valuation? What would be the main topic of discussion in like 5 years in the future?
Okay. I mean, ESG was a big one coming through the last few years, and I think for people with ESG, people kind of throw that branding around. It all of to me, on the advisor side, it kind of came in overnight a little bit. All of a sudden, there was this pressure from an ESG perspective that building owners needed to start improving their buildings. They needed to hit certain credentials. The banks would be starting to put more emphasis on it from financing and these side of things. So I think the ESG part of it a couple of years ago started having a short-term impact on people's views. I don't think it materially impacted values. You know, there was, when you look at the RICS, they were kind of saying you need to take it into account. That's all that was said. So there was a lot of emphasis on it, but no direction. And so as a valuer, there was no real change. We kind of had to take it into account, but and comment on it, but there wasn't really a much emphasis on it. I think in 10 years in terms of valuation, I mean, now inflation's gone down. We're not seeing big indexation on things like rents. I think that was a challenge. There was a lot of building owners that were expecting to see, because the rents were going up due to indexation, they were expecting to see 10, 20% increase in values, which was clearly never going to happen. Look, in 2030, who knows where we'll be. But I don't think the valuation landscape will change much. I think it's very conservative and very ingrained in this market. So I don't think we'll see much fluctuation. The fluctuation in valuation and how valuation is done and carried out in this market, I think all those changes have already occurred. I don't think you'll see. Now the market's much more professionalized. The banks know what they're doing, the borrowers know what they're doing, the valuers know what they're doing, and I don't think you'll see much by way of difference, to be honest.
Okay. And if you could give us just one advice, like for young professionals starting out in valuation today, what would it be?
Travel. Look, I mean, I think that I started as a valuer, and I think looking at other markets is a really great thing to do. I mean, we're lucky in this region because you've got 6 or 7 markets that are all quite close with each other, and you've got multiple clients that kind of cross-border. A lot of the banks are the same banks. But I mean, look, valuation is always the best way to get into real estate because, I mean, I'm still astounded that, I wouldn't say it's in my company so much, but it probably is, you'll have leasing agents often that will be saying to landlords, you need to reduce your rent by €2 because we can't lease this building. But they don't understand that that reduction has a massive impact on the value. And so that's what really gets me in commercial real estate, is that there's such a lack of awareness from the transactional side of things, what impacts evaluation. And so there'll be these lazy comments of reduce your rent or increase the fit-out contribution or these things, but you can't. Like, it just doesn't work that way. So that's why valuation to me was the best start, because you understood how a building was valued. And then when you go into other sides of it, from my side I went more into transactions, you understood how small things on a deal have a major impact on the value. And so yeah, I think it is the best way. I think there's a lot of tendency for people to want to go and do deals And I think they're the exciting things, but at least a year or two in valuation is by far the best way to do it.
Okay, and by the way, Andrew, I also heard that your wife works in commercial real estate too. So be honest with us, does that cost ever some professional discussions at home, or do you two have like rule, no work at home, no professional discussions at home?
Well, she works for a Czech investment fund, so she's, I'm not sure I can match some of the discussions, but it's such a common thing that real estate is such an environment where everybody seems to know everybody, and so it's quite a kind of common occurrence. But I wouldn't say that that's probably something that goes. We have enough Netflix, I think, to deal with than anything.
Okay, okay, thank you. And how do you see the future of AI in the field of valuation?
I mean, I think this touches on that topic I was saying earlier on about when you're a valuer. And actually, Misha in my office, I was talking about her with this recently. There's some parts of the feeling that you won't need valuers going forward, or you'll just need one or two to check the outputs of AI, which I completely disagree with. Look, if you look at a valuation report that we do, 80–90% of that report is text that you need to include. Location of the building, transport, these types of things, you know, economic data, unemployment, inflation, these things, we have to put them in. It's the requirement of whether it's the bank or the fund that we include this information. Clearly, all of that you can do through AI. Like, there's no problem with that. But there's a question is, do people really sit and read through that? Probably not. What people read is the summary of the valuation and the valuation itself. Now, I mean, look at an office building. Even today, I still struggle with certain clauses around break options and how you deal with a break option in a lease, because often they're worded so vaguely that it's really difficult to actually understand who's got the rights and who can terminate in these things. So I don't understand, and I'm sure it will improve, but today you can't do that through AI. You can't value a building unless it's a really single tenant, what we call a vanilla deal, which is one tenant, a really simple lease. Clearly, that's a simple thing to do. But if you're valuing a shopping centre or a multi-leased office building, it's impossible. And so I don't know how that's going to be possible for the foreseeable future through AI. And also the point I was making earlier on, when I get brought into valuation, we have the team that run the valuations. When I get brought in, it's because there's an issue. Whether it's an issue of a difference of opinion of an assumption, a rent, a yield, wherever we are. But again, it's human interaction that is needed for that. So, you know, I wish I didn't get brought in on a lot of those things, because it tends to be that we're not high enough on a number, and then it's up to us to explain why we're not. But that's where I think, again, it won't come. So, look, the bulk of a report you can do through AI, but it's the meaningless parts of the report, I would say. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way, but it is the parts that aren't really impacting people's decision-making. And I think the points that make the decisions are the assumptions, and AI can't do that. So I don't know how they can foresee where office rents will go to, or if a tenant will break, and how long that space will need to release, and these types of points. I find that impossible. So maybe I'm getting old and I don't know. But.
Okay, sorry to interrupt you, but the time is slowly finishing. So I would like to ask you, Mr. Peirson, if you have any last words that you would like to say before the questions, or...
Okay, so I would like just to say thank you very much for coming here and for taking us to this journey. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much too. And now it's your time, audience. You can ask your questions, you can ask them live, or pokud si nejste jistí svojí angličtinou, můžete využít náš QR kód a kolegyňka vám dotaz klidně přeloží za vás. Takže pokud někdo z vás si troufá a rád by položil dotaz v tuto chvíli, můžete se přihlásit. Tak, výborně.
Good afternoon. My name is Laboutkova. I'm from Prague University of Economics and Business, and I would like to ask you about the environment, actually the quality of the environment, because you, in the beginning, you compare the markets, and so I wonder, how do you evaluate the environment from the institutions and rules point of view? Thank you.
Sorry, when you environment, you're talking about?
Quality environment for this business, for the you know, because you do the evaluation, you know the Czech market, you spoke about it, you spoke about the pressure of the, you know, different actors. So this is my question about the rules.
Yeah, yeah. Look, I think there's a relatively healthy environment in the Czech market. It's super competitive, I think, the Czech market. So, you know, for instance, I spent quite a few years in Belgrade, which is a market not many people know, but Belgrade is a city of 1.7 million people, and there was 2 big real estate firms. It was ourselves and CBRE. That was it. And you come into a market like Czech and Prague, which is, what, 1.3 million, and our competition is endless. Like, there's so many companies trying to do the same thing. From the investor side of things as well, it's incredibly fierce with those Czech real estate funds. The industrial market, I think, is probably the most fierce in terms of competition, because if you look at the different sectors, logistics and industrial has been the one that's seen the biggest growth in value. A lot of it was impacted by COVID, and there was a lot of kind of, you know, when it came through internet deliveries and these things, was a short-term jump on that. There was a lot of movement of manufacturing and logistics into Czech from Germany. There was a lot of these things going on. And what we saw was industrial values skyrocket in this market. And I would say there's quite, at times, an unhealthy competition between some of the logistic developers to find land in this market, get land permitted and to build. And I think that's where there's a line where sometimes there's a tendency it could be crossed in terms of some of the competition between people. I think the residential developers are pretty much the same as well. I think in Prague there's a lot of this land banking going on with the residential developers to try and bank as much land as possible. So they've got future pipeline. But it's, look, I've been in way worse markets than this, but it's, yeah, I would say, but what I would say for Czech in terms of the environment for business generally, it's by far the hardest market in Central and Eastern Europe, because, I mean, look from a service provider standpoint, and I know there's people from different markets here, but because of the competition, the fee levels we get are the lowest. So if we value say if we sell a shopping centre for 100 million euros, we'll be on a percentage level of that sale. It used to be 1%. That was the golden price. It's probably 0.1 now, 0.2. So our fee levels are plummeted because of the level of competition. But the salary levels that we've paid in the last 20 years have quadrupled. And so as a market, it's by far our hardest market, because we can still go into Romania, Bulgaria, Serbia and pull off big deals, and we don't have competition, so we can generate big fees. The more competitive the market, obviously the fee levels will be challenged, but it's also the employment costs are so high here. Not just the basic salary costs, but tax, insurance, everything on top makes it very, very competitive. So it's healthy-ish, but it could be healthier.
Okay, thank you very much. Is there anyone else who would like to ask a question directly at this moment? Yes, there in the back, please.
Brabec, Department of Finance of this university. I would like to ask you, I'm not sure if I caught the intention of the speech about ESG. Have you said that ESG is not very important in the case of valuation, or it might become important?
Look, it is important. It's what the direction of the discussion is. So, for instance, you know, we follow the RICS Red Book when we value. And until January this year, there was no direction. It just said you have to comment on it. And all it needed was a few lines to say we've taken into account ESG requirements, and that's been factored into our valuation. From January this year, all of a sudden they said you have to take it into account. So you have to, your valuation has to be impacted by ESG, which again is really such an open discussion point. Like, I don't know what that would mean. So actually I think it's not even changed at all. I mean, every time we value now, we've got to keep thinking about ESG, because ESG impacts the rent, because if it's a new building, tenants will pay more for it. And if it's energy efficient, then it can generate a higher rent because energy costs are going to be lower. So, and also with yield, you know, an investor's not going to buy a 20-year-old building without any sustainability credentials. So the bank won't finance a building without those credentials, or if they do, their financing costs will be skyrocketed again. So it's really important. What I was saying earlier on is that there's no direction from above of how we talk about it or how we write about it in evaluation. As a valuer, we take it into account through the yield and the rent. And the yield is what would an investor pay for that building based upon its attractiveness in the market. And so we are taking into account already, and we always were, and it's the same with the rents as well. If you've got a 20-year-old office building, again, without any sustainability credentials, it means you can never lease that building to a global company. So the target market's limited, therefore the rent's going to be lower. So it's super important in terms of our assumptions. My point is there's no direction given in terms of how we talk about it in a valuation. You know, the banks will look at how they finance a building, and they'll look at kind of the grading level of buildings in Czech. I think it's A to G. And so if you're at G, then you're either not going to be financed or it's going to be really expensive. And if you're at A, every bank will want to finance it because it's good for them to finance a building that's sustainable. So it's really important. It's just my challenge is how we talk about it and how we write about it, because there's no clear distinction. And again, something that I don't think AI would help with.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. A round of applause for Mr. Peirson.
Okay.